Welcome to Historic Skylines, where the shadows of the past reveal stories that shaped our world. Today, we step into the black and white corridors of history and age, when nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Mongolia carved an empire so vast it stretched from the edges of Europe to the Pacific shores of China. At the heart of this empire stood a name etched in both fear and awe: Kublai Khan. The year was 1271, and with the rise of the Yuan Dynasty, China found itself under the rule of a foreign power for the first time in centuries. Kublai Khan, grandson of the mighty Genghis Khan, sought not only to conquer, but to govern, a challenge far greater than the clash of armies. In his court, silk met steel, tradition met innovation. And cultures from Persia, India, and Europe mingled with the Chinese way of life. Yet behind the grandeur lay tension, the friction of conquerors and the conquered, the ambition of empire and the fragility of power. This is the story of the Yuan Dynasty under Kublai Khan, an empire built in conquest, tested in governance, and remembered as a turning point in world history. The story of Kublai Khan's rise to power begins with a man who carried the blood of a legend, his grandfather, Genghis Khan. Born in 1215, Kublai grew up in a world where the Mongols had already shaken the foundations of Asia and Europe. Yet, unlike many of his kinsmen, Kublai was not only a warrior, he was also a thinker, drawn to the wealth, sophistication, and traditions of the Chinese world he sought to conquer. This dual identity, half Mongol warrior, half Chinese ruler, would define his destiny. In the mid-13th century, the Mongols had already subdued northern China under the Yuan Dynasty. But the southern realm, ruled by the Song Dynasty, stood defiant. Kublai's brother Ming Khan, the Great Khan, ordered him to lead the Mongol armies into Song territory. Kublai proved himself a skilled strategist, combining Mongol cavalry with Chinese engineers and siege weapons. His campaigns were brutal but effective, pushing the Song toward collapse. Yet in 1259, tragedy struck. Ming died during the war in Sichuan. Suddenly, the battlefield turned into a political struggle. Kublai rushed back to claim the title of Great Khan. But his rival brother Arik Baka also declared himself the rightful successor. The empire fractured into civil war. After years of bitter fighting, Kublai emerged victorious in 1264, but the unity of Genghis Khan's empire had already been shattered. Kublai now turned his eyes fully toward China. He realized that to rule the Chinese people, he had to do more than conquer them. He had to win their recognition. In 1271, he proclaimed a new dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, adopting the Chinese dynastic title to present himself as a legitimate son of heaven. His new capital was established at Kublai, modern-day Beijing. But legitimacy did not come easily. Many Chinese saw the Mongols as outsiders, unworthy of ruling the Middle Kingdom. Still, Kublai pressed forward. He surrounded himself with Confucian scholars, adopted Chinese court rituals, and presented himself as a ruler who respected tradition. At the same time, he maintained his Mongol roots, keeping his armies loyal and his family power intact. By 1279, after decades of struggle, Kublai achieved what had seemed impossible. The last Song stronghold fell at the Battle of Yamen, where the Song fleet was annihilated. For the first time in history, the whole of China was under foreign rule. The Mongol conquest was complete, and the Yuan Dynasty stood as the ruling power of one of the world's greatest civilizations. This was the beginning of a bold new era in empire, where the steppes met the Great Wall. The traditions of two worlds collided. But as history would show, founding the Yuan Dynasty was only the first step in Kublai Khan's long and difficult journey to govern an empire of immense diversity and complexity. When Kublai Khan sat on the throne as emperor of the Yuan Dynasty, he faced a challenge far greater than the battlefield: how to rule China. A land with millions of people, centuries of tradition, and a bureaucracy more complex than any steppe warrior could imagine. Unlike the swift victories of cavalry charges, ruling required patience, compromise, and vision. Kublai Khan attempted something no Mongol ruler had done before. Instead of rejecting Chinese institutions, he adapted them, reserved much of the Confucian-based bureaucracy, but reshaped it to ensure Mongol dominance. At the very top of the government were Mongols, who held the highest offices and controlled the military. Below them came Central Asians and Muslims, trusted administrators from across the empire, who acted as intermediaries. Chinese officials, despite their vast knowledge and experience, were deliberately placed lower in the hierarchy. This system, called the four-class structure, revealed both genius and danger. On one hand, it kept power firmly in Mongol hands, ensuring loyalty to the Khan. On the other, it alienated the very Chinese scholars and officials who had long sustained China's governance. Many literati saw the Yuan rulers as outsiders who disrespected their traditions. Yet Kublai's pragmatism often outweighed rigid Mongol pride. He embraced the Chinese practice of centralized taxation and census taking. He encouraged irrigation and agricultural reforms to stabilize food supplies. Under his rule, the Grand Canal was expanded to ensure grain could flow from the fertile south to the capital in the north. These measures brought stability to a land scarred by decades of war, but contradictions lingered. Kublai's court glittered with diversity. Persian astronomers, Arab doctors, Tibetan lamas, and European travelers mingled in Kublai. Yet beneath the cosmopolitan surface, resentment grew. The Chinese population faced heavy taxes, forced labor, and strict restrictions. The civil service examinations, once the ladder to power for Chinese scholars, were curtailed. Denying many their traditional path to office, Kublai's governance was thus a balancing act. Mongol dominance combined with Chinese tradition, innovation blended with exclusion. For a time, it worked. The Yuan Dynasty maintained order and projected strength. But seeds of tension had already been planted. The very structure that upheld Mongol supremacy also fueled discontent, ensuring that the dynasty's rule would always be seen as fragile, imposed, and foreign. Perhaps the most transformative legacy of the Yuan dynasty was its role in connecting the world. Under Kublai Khan, the old dream of Genghis Khan empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean took on a new shape. The Yuan dynasty became the beating heart of the Silk Road, a bridge between East and West. For centuries, the Silk Road had carried goods and ideas across Asia. But under Mongol protection, it flourished like never before. Caravans traveled with relative safety, guarded by Mongol patrols. Merchants from Persia, India, Arabia, and even Europe flocked to Yuan China, bringing not only goods but also cultures and knowledge. In the bustling markets of Kublai, one could see silks and porcelain from Chinese artisans, spices from India, carpets from Persia, and gems from Central Asia. But the exchanges were not limited to goods. Islamic scholars introduced new advances in astronomy and medicine. Chinese innovations like printing and gunpowder began to seep westward. Even foods, fashions, and artistic styles blended in this great meeting ground. The Yuan dynasty also opened its doors to foreign visitors. Among the most famous was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who spent nearly 2 decades in Kublai Khan's court. His accounts, though sometimes exaggerated, painted a picture of a vast, wealthy, and sophisticated empire. For Europe, struggling in the medieval era, Polo's tales were like windows into another world in advanced civilization where paper money circulated. Roads stretched endlessly, and cities gleamed with wealth. Yet the Yuan's role in global trade was not without strain. Heavy taxation on peasants supported luxury consumption at court. The reliance on paper money, unbacked by stable reserves, led to inflation and financial crises. Still, for a time, the Yuan dynasty stood as a symbol of global interconnectedness, where the eastward winds carried silk and porcelain, and the westward winds carried glass, gems, and stories. The Silk Road during the Yuan dynasty was more than a trade route. It was a network of civilizations, and at its center stood Kublai Khan's empire, opening China not only to conquest, but also to the currents of the wider world. The Yuan dynasty was more than swords, and trade. It was a time when cultures collided and blended. Leaving a mark on China's artistic and spiritual life, Kublai Khan, though a Mongol by blood, presided over a court where Chinese, Tibetan, Persian, and Islamic traditions intermingled. Religion was central. Kublai himself favored Tibetan Buddhism, inviting lamas to his court and supporting the spread of Buddhist temples. At the same time, Islam flourished under the influence of Central Asian administrators. Christianity, too, had its place, with Nestorian and even Catholic missionaries finding protection under Mongol rule. The Yuan capital became a rare place where mosques, temples, and churches could coexist, an empire of many faiths. Art reflected this diversity. Chinese painters, long inspired by song traditions, adapted to new influences. Bold brushwork and dramatic landscapes flourished. Drama, particularly Chinese opera, found strong support. Yuan playwrights like Guan Hanqing wrote plays that captured the struggles of ordinary people, giving voice to themes of justice, corruption, and survival. These plays remain classics of Chinese literature to this day. Literature, however, also bore marks of suppression. Many Chinese scholars resented the Mongols for diminishing their role in government. Shut out from official service, they turned to writing, poetry, and theater as outlets for their frustrations. In this sense, Mongol exclusion indirectly fueled a burst of cultural creativity. The blending of Mongol steppe traditions with Chinese artistry created a cultural mosaic. Ceramics bore Persian designs, while Chinese architectural forms adopted Central Asian motifs. The empire became a canvas upon which many civilizations painted their marks. The Yuan Dynasty thus became not only a political empire, but also a cultural experiment where Mongols, Chinese, and foreigners coexisted, clashed, and created together. No empire, however grand, is eternal. For all its triumphs, the Yuan Dynasty carried within it the seeds of its decline. The very structure that gave the Mongols dominance also alienated their subjects. Chinese resentment simmered beneath the surface, fueled by heavy taxation, forced labor, and discriminatory policies. Financial troubles grew worse. The reliance on paper money, issued without sufficient reserves, caused inflation. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Famines and floods devastated the countryside, and the government often failed to provide relief. The once mighty Yuan court, filled with riches and foreign wonders, became increasingly detached from the suffering of the people. Rebellions erupted. Secret societies, often cloaked in religious symbolism, organized resistance. Among them, the Red Turban Rebellion gained momentum, uniting peasants, monks, and scholars against Mongol rule. By the mid-14th century, the empire was crumbling. In 1368, the Yuan capital at Kublai fell to rebel forces led by Zhu Yuanzhang, who declared the founding of the Ming Dynasty. The Mongols retreated to the north, their dream of ruling all China shattered, yet the Yuan Dynasty left behind a profound legacy. It had united China under foreign rule for the first time, creating a centralized empire that blended Mongol strength with Chinese tradition. It had opened China to global trade, linking East and West in ways that shaped world history. It had fostered cultural exchange, bringing together diverse religions, arts, and sciences. Though the Yuan dynasty fell, its echoes remained. The Ming inherited many of its institutions, while Europe, inspired by tales of Marco Polo and the wealth of the East, would soon set sail toward its own age of exploration. The Yuan dynasty was a chapter of contradiction, glory and decay, openness and oppression, innovation and decline. Its story reminds us that even the most powerful empires are fragile, but their legacies can outlast their fall.